In the final fading years of China's Three Kingdoms period, one man's story stands out. His name was Jiang Wei. He was the chosen heir of the legendary strategist Zhuge Liang and the last general of a dying kingdom. But his story, well, it's a real puzzle.
And this is the question, isn't it? The one that defines his entire life. Was he this noble warrior, fighting against impossible odds to fulfill his master's dying wish? Or was his relentless ambition the very thing that bled his nation dry and hurried it to its grave?
You know, the answer really depends on what you read. If you pick up the famous novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, he's portrayed as this near-perfect hero. But if you dig into the actual historical records, the story gets way more complicated and, frankly, a lot more fascinating. We're talking about a man whose greatest strengths might have been his most fatal flaws. To really get who Jiang Wei was, we have to start at the beginning. And his origin story is kind of shocking, because Jiang Wei didn't start out as a hero of Shu Han. No way. He actually started his career as an officer for their mortal enemy, the state of Wei. So picture this. It's 228 AD. Zhuge Liang is leading an invasion. Jiang Wei's own commander gets paranoid, suspects him of treason, and just abandons him. Jiang Wei gets back to his city only to find the gates are locked. With nowhere left to go, he has no choice but to surrender to Shu. And it's there that Zhuge Liang himself sees this incredible potential in him. He proves his worth time and again. He helps save the entire army after Zhuge Liang dies, and later on, he even welcomes a high-ranking prince from Wei, who defects. I mean, talk about a huge propaganda win. And you have to understand the sheer weight of these words. This wasn't just a compliment. This was an anointment. Zhuge Liang, the most respected man in the entire kingdom, essentially just pointed to this former enemy and named him as his successor. Can you imagine the pressure? An immense burden was placed on Jiang Wei's shoulders from that day on. And Jiang Wei spent the rest of his life trying to live up to that. As soon as he got full command of the military, he went all in on his mentor's dream of conquering the North. He just launched one relentless campaign after another. 11. Think about that. 11 major campaigns in just 15 years. For a small, resource-poor state like Shu, that number is just staggering. It shows his single-minded obsession. He truly believed that to sit still was to accept defeat, so he was always on the attack. And for a moment, it really seemed like it might actually work. In 255 AD, he pulled off what might be the single greatest victory Shu Han ever won against Wei in an open field battle. The scale of this victory was just incredible. At the Battle of Didao, he didn't just beat the Wei army, he completely annihilated it. We're talking tens of thousands of enemy soldiers killed or captured. The entire region was on the brink of collapse. The dream was so close, he could almost taste it. But just 1 year later, his luck completely ran out. Maybe he was overconfident, maybe he pushed too far, but he was lured into a devastating trap by his great rival, the Wei general Deng Ai. The result was a catastrophic defeat at Duan Valley. This loss was an absolute disaster. It shattered all the momentum from the year before. The historical records have this one very telling line, quote, "The people of Shu were filled with complaints," and that tells you everything. Back home, the constant warfare was finally taking its toll. The people were getting tired. And you can bet Jiang Wei's political enemies were sharpening their knives. Because here's the thing about Jiang Wei. His greatest opponent wasn't on the battlefield. It was inside his own palace. He was a master at managing an army, but when it came to court politics, he was totally out of his depth. His nemesis was a corrupt eunuch named Huang Hao, who had the weak emperor completely under his thumb. Huang Hao saw the popular general as a threat and worked day and night to undermine him. Jiang Wei actually went to the emperor and begged him to execute the eunuch, but the emperor just cried and refused. This left Jiang Wei in a terrifying spot. He was no longer safe in his own capital. So, fearing for his own life, Jiang Wei did the unthinkable. He took his army and retreated to a remote border fort, basically going into a self-imposed exile to avoid being killed. And this decision had a fatal consequence. Shu's best general was now far, far away from the center of power, leaving the entire government in the hands of his worst enemy. And it was from this exile that he made his most controversial decision ever. He dismantled Shu's proven, rock-solid defensive strategy, one that had worked for decades, and replaced it with a really complex, high-risk plan to lure the enemy in and then trap them. It was a brilliant idea on paper, but it was a gamble that would cost him everything. Because the very next year, Wei invaded. And Jiang Wei's big gamble failed, catastrophically. The enemy just marched right through the mountain passes he had intentionally left open. But even with his kingdom collapsing all around him, Jiang Wei had one last unbelievable plan up his sleeve. So while Jiang Wei's main army was pinned down in a fortress, the enemy general Gang Ai took this impossible route through the mountains and just appeared outside the defenseless capital. The emperor surrendered immediately. Just like that, the state of Shu Han was gone. Jiang Wei, his army still completely intact, was ordered to lay down his arms. But what he did next is the stuff of legend. He faked his surrender to the victorious Wei general, Zhong Hui. He then got close to him, played on his massive ego, and convinced him to rebel against his own state. The plan was absolutely insane. Get Zhong Hui to kill all the other Wei officers, then Jiang Wei would kill Zhong Hui, seize his army, and restore the kingdom of Shu. It was brilliant, it was desperate, and it was a total long shot. But the plot was discovered. The Wei's soldiers mutinied, and in the chaos, Jiang Wei was cornered and killed, fighting to the very end. And with his death, the last, final hope of Shu Han was extinguished forever. So we come right back to our original question. How should history remember this man? Because his legacy is just one of pure contradiction. On the one hand, his critics argue that his obsessive campaigns bled a fragile state dry, making its collapse inevitable. But his defenders? They say he was just doing his duty. He was following his master's order to restore the Han dynasty. And for a small kingdom like Shu, sitting still and playing defense was just a slow death. The only chance they had was to stay on the attack. There is a fascinating detail from the historical accounts that I think perfectly captures his character. It's said that when his body was examined after his death, his gallbladder was found to be abnormally large, which in that culture was a traditional sign of almost superhuman audacity and courage. It's just a perfect metaphor for the man himself. And that leaves us with the final question. He was loyal to the very end, to his mentor, to his kingdom, and to a dream he had to have known was impossible. But in the end, was that unwavering loyalty the trait of a true hero? Or was it the very flaw that blinded him, leading both him and his country straight to ruin?